Have you ever been hiking in New England or just walking through the woods and come across a stone wall? A better question might be, when hasn't this happened to you? Stone walls mark a time in Vermont's ecological and cultural history, and so do the trees that have grown up around them. Today, trees, stone walls, and the deforestation and reforestation of the Green Mountains. Good afternoon, and thank you for stopping by Across the Fence. I'm Keith Silva, in for Amy Finley. When the Trees Came Back, The Great Battle to Save Vermont's Forest is published by the Vermont Historical Society and takes a piercing look at the environmental changes, conservation efforts, and key figures shaping Vermont's forest history and the early settlement to modern times. Our guest today is Robert Mello, a retired Vermont Superior Court judge, a hiker, and the author of 3 books, including his latest, When the Trees Came Back, The Great Battle to Save Vermont's Forest. Thanks for coming in to talk with me, Bob.
My pleasure to be here.
Before we get into your book, I am always fascinated by author dedications, and you provide one that suggests there's more there. You write, "To the park ranger so long ago who encouraged me to explore my first forest." What's that story, Bob?
Well, I grew up in Falmouth, Massachusetts. I loved walking through the pine-scented woods behind our house. We had a park, and the park ranger noticed how much I enjoyed nature, and he encouraged me to explore the town forest. We had a 500-acre town forest in Falmouth. So I did. And one day when I was exploring a large, marshy, swampy area in the town forest, I unexpectedly scared up a crane that had been hiding in the tall grasses and reeds. And I froze in awe as this enormous bird lifted off the swamp and flew off on enormous, powerful wings. That was more than 60 years ago. But it's like I can still remember it as if it were yesterday. That encounter is so memorable. I don't remember the name of the ranger, and the town doesn't have any record of who he was anymore, but I'll always be grateful to him for introducing me to a lifelong love of forests and natural areas.
I knew there was a good story there, and you tell it so well, and you're right, there is definitely, it's clearly had an impact on you. You begin your history of Vermont's forest when it was at its most Edenic. What was the land that we call Vermont before white settlers arrived?
Well, back then it was covered by a dense forest, thousands of years in the making, a wide variety of rich, diverse trees and other plants covered the entire territory. Many of the trees over hundreds of years old and over 100 feet tall, towering over a landscape teeming with wildlife. There were springs everywhere, and our rivers and streams were full of fish and clean water.
I would call that as close to Eden as one possibly could. So what happens in the first 100 years once settlers arrive? What's the immediate impact?
Well, in the 1760s, settlers in huge numbers began to come to Vermont from southern New England and southern New York. And they were farmers. And so they cut down just vast tracts of land, forests, to create farms for their crops and their animals. And at the same time, loggers were cutting down trees, and sawmills and factories were manufacturing huge amounts of lumber for a growing population.
One of the things I referenced in my opening was stone walls in Vermont and New England, which is thanks in one part to one man and millions of sheep. Tell me about William Jarvis. Who was he?
Jarvis was a farmer from Wethersfield. He was also U.S. consul to Portugal. And while he was there, he discovered merino sheep in Spain. They were the King of Spain's prized possession, a big secret. He discovered their enormously luxuriant wool. It was a very special kind of wool. He brought 400 of them to Wethersfield, and soon after that, Congress enacted some tariffs and his wool business exploded. Suddenly, every farmer in Vermont needed to have a herd of sheep, and every town had sheep, sometimes thousands of them. And farmers cut down enormous acres of trees just to be able to pasture their sheep. Addison County had produced more wool than any other county in the country.
Amazing.
So it was a short-lived phenomenon, but the effect on the forest was not short-lived.
And that's where we get our stone walls from. Sheep can't jump that high, so we had stone walls keeping all those sheep in place.
Yep.
And they chewed down what the foresters couldn't take out. And then this was one thing I learned from your book. What did Vermont's iron industry finish off that the sheep industry started?
Well, the iron industry was one of the most devastating to the forests. To make iron, you need enormous quantities of charcoal. And to make charcoal, you need to cut down enormous quantities of wood and smolder them into charcoal. And even a small iron mill will need a couple hundred acres of trees every year cut down to smolder into charcoal. And so by the 1880s, there were tens of thousands of acres of forest being cut down every year just to make charcoal.
And these mills that you talk about, these were everywhere in Vermont. It wasn't like there was one region that was the mill, the mill town. Every town had an iron mill, so all the trees in that surrounding area would have gone to charcoal. So it's 1760, and it's been about 100 years, about the start of the, 1760 is when white settlers arrive. 100 years later, what does Vermont look like with these iron mills and sheep and everything else that have taken their turn?
So just before the Civil War, by that time, after 100 years of all this clear cutting, 60% of Vermont was bare. Only 40% of Vermont still had forests. The forests were disappearing, springs were drying up, rivers and streams were shrinking, wildlife was being decimated, and much of Vermont's, and the situation was getting worse. It would soon become 25% forested, 75% nude.
Right, and this is about the same time, George Perkins Marsh publishes Man in Nature. Why does he write this book? Is it just his observations from living in Woodstock and living in Vermont?
As a child, he loved nature. To him, trees, plants, and animals were persons, not things. And as he grew up in Woodstock, he saw firsthand the environmental devastation caused by clear cutting. So in the 1840s, he became U.S. consul to Turkey, and then in 1861 he became U.S. consul to Italy. So he spent a lot of time in Europe and the Middle East, and he saw how in Europe decades of deforestation had turned beautiful areas into deserts, uninhabitable deserts. And he wrote the book because he was afraid Americans were making the same mistake and would suffer the same catastrophic consequences if they kept clear cutting all their forests.
So this is a landmark book when this comes out, and its impact it's a soft landing, shall we say. It's not until 10 years later that Marsh's work actually sort of picks up. So you talk about 1880 to 1910 as the age of the great timber, paper mills, and railroads. What happens in these 30 years from Man in Nature to the early 20th century?
Some of the most abusive lumbering practices occurred during those 30 years. The demand for lumber and paper was high, and huge profits could be made by the timber barons and the logging railroads and the paper manufacturers. And so Vermont's tree cover dropped to 25% during this period. And by 1910, Vermont was the least forested state in New England. Even Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island had more forest cover than we did.
Wow, that's amazing to think about. Just a couple minutes to wrap up, but the story ends well. It's a happy story. Folks will have to read how it ends, but this is where conservation enters the conversation. Who were the first leaders of the conservation movement in Vermont at that time?
Joseph Patel was a major leader from Middlebury. Lewis Jones from the University of Vermont, and Ostinoff Hawes, who was our first state forester, were the main leaders. Patel proposed the first resolution that the legislature ever passed to do something to protect the forests. And he personally bought 37,000 acres of land to preserve, forest land to preserve in Addison County and surrounding areas. Camel's Hump was his greatest contribution. He bought the summit and gave it to the state in 1911. Jones took a loose organization of concerned citizens, created the Forestry Association of Vermont, and got dozens of Vermont's most senior important citizens to join in and join the cause. And Hawes created our first Forest Service and introduced forestry, sustainable scientific forestry, to farmers and lumbermen.
30 seconds left. Any chance of getting back to 25% forested land? We've put in a lot of things in place legislatively, and obviously conservation, and those things are very near and dear to the heart of Vermonters. Is there a worry that we could go back to that devastation?
Absolutely. Vermont's forests are the exact reverse of what they were 100 years ago. Today, 75% of the state is forested. We are one of the most forested states in the nation. It's because we've adopted public ownership of forests and sustainable forest practices. And we've outlawed the worst of the lumbering practices. We need to, but the risk of backsliding is always there. We need to continue these programs and deal with the current crises that the forests are facing in today's world. I hope that my book will help today's stewards to continue to improve the condition of our forests for the future.
Well, great way to end it, Bob. Thank you very much. When the Trees Came Back, The Great Battle to Save Vermont's Forests is available now wherever you get your books. Of course, on Across the Fence, we encourage you to visit your local library and speak with a librarian. My thanks to the team here at WCAX, all of whom have hearts of oak. I'm Keith Silva. This is Across the Fence. Thanks for being part of our family.